Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We will start promptly in about 60 seconds. Thank you for joining us. It looks like we have several people joining in. Again, welcome. We will get started in just one moment. Okay, so it is 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and so we will get started. Again, welcome to today's webinar on cultural intelligence and racial equity. My name is Sandra Upton, and I am with the Cultural Intelligence Center, and I will be your host and moderator for today's discussion. Here at the Cultural Intelligence Center, I oversee all of the work that we do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, both across North America and across the globe. And we are just delighted that you have joined us today. This is one of our largest attended webinars. It does not surprise me given the topic, but we are so glad that you are joining us. We have folks, of course, from all over North America, but we also have folks joining us from the UK, from South Africa, from Hong Kong, from Slovakia, and from many, many other parts of the world. So again, we are glad that you are joining us, and I am just thrilled for you to have the opportunity to hear from our amazing team of panelists today. But before I introduce or allow our panelists to introduce themselves, I just want to set the stage for our discussion today, because this is such an important topic. It can also be a very sensitive topic, but I want to make sure that I do a bit of level setting to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of our approach and philosophy behind this work. So the first thing I want to say as it relates to the webinar itself is you all are muted. You're going to stay muted for the entire duration of the webinar. If for some reason you get cut off, just click the link that you used initially to join back in. There will be an opportunity for Q&A after the panelists have the opportunity to present. So you can see now that you have access to the Q&A box. As we are having our discussion, feel free to type in questions along the way. And again, on the back end, we will take some time to answer as many of those questions as we possibly can. The webinar will be recorded. Thank you all for joining, but I know we had several people. We've got several hundred folks on the call today, but we've had several people ask about the recording. It will be recorded and available on our website within 24 hours of this session today. So if you can see the screen in front of you, you see a big number there, and that number is $66 billion. Some of you may know what that number represents. Many of you may not, but I'm going to tell you. So that 66 billion number represents the amount of financial investment that Fortune 1000 companies made specifically to racial equity work in 2020. Just racial equity work, Fortune 1000 companies committed $66 billion to the work. Yet, we are seeing, when we look at the statistics, we have not moved the needle very much. We are still struggling, and our overall progress is still slow. So we have this massive financial commitment, but yet we're not making progress. Why do we think that is? Well, when we think about racial equity, we like to think about it within the context of our overall DEI work and journey. DEI, again, standing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our approach and philosophy is that everybody is on a journey. We never fully complete the journey, but we do try and make our way through that journey, and we do try and make good progress as we are going along that journey. But there are really 5 key stages to that journey. The first stage is to really assess your current state. And as we think about that within the context of racial equity, what is your current state? How do you feel your organization is doing with regard to every employee having equitable opportunities and experiences in that organization? Once you do that assessment, you're obviously going to find, very likely going to find some gaps in terms of the work and the work that's needed. And so that next stage is then to begin to explore what culturally intelligent solutions might be appropriate for some of those challenges or gaps that you're finding as you look at your work. That third stage is then let's execute. Let's actually implement the work and implement those solutions to move us towards better outcomes. That fourth stage is measuring the work. You know, it's one thing to do the work. It's another thing to really assess whether or not the work is actually working. And so that measurement piece is really key. And then that last step, which is really ongoing, and that is to sustain the work. So all 5 of these steps or stages or blocks are critical to our work in the DEI space and critical to our work as it relates to racial equity. One of the reasons at least, we believe that even with all of this massive financial investment into this work, one of the reasons we believe that we are stalled is because organizations are still struggling with what to do. They really are still struggling with how to execute the work. What do we really do? What does the work really look like? And so that's one of the things that we're going to delve in today. Is how do we effectively execute the appropriate culturally intelligent strategies to move our work specific to racial equity forward? And we believe very strongly that cultural intelligence, or CQ for short, for those of you that may be learning this language for the first time, we believe that it really is the foundation and strategic link to addressing racial equity. So when we think about definitions, I want to lay these 2 out in front of you because they will guide this conversation. What do we mean by racial equity, right? Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if racial identity no longer predicted outcomes or fair treatment. So this definition comes with assumptions that there are unfair and inequitable actions and treatments towards certain groups, and in particular, groups of color. You know, so wherever you are in the world, you might call it marginalized groups or underrepresented groups. You might call them BIPOC groups, right? But it's this idea that we create a condition where people are not treated unfairly or unjust because of the color of their skin. And we know that there are many, many other forms of inequity, gender, right? You know, we look at LGBTQ plus community, their inequities. So we fully recognize that, but for purposes of today's conversation, we're looking specifically at racial equity. So if that's the definition of racial equity, how do we think about CQ within the context of it being a solution to it? So let's first make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean by cultural intelligence. So cultural intelligence, or CQ, is the capability to function and relate effectively in multicultural situations. It is a skill, and as we develop that skill, it allows us to function and relate effectively in any multicultural situation. So when we think about racial equity, it is almost impossible to fully address it, to effectively address it without developing the cultural intelligence of the people that are part of the work, as well as developing culturally intelligent policies and practices. So here is just a quick slide, and I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read my screen, but you can see when we talk about CQ being the foundation and strategic link to addressing racial equity, we highlight, you know, where we get stuck when we try to address racial equity without CQ. We do things like we dump a lot of money into the work, right? But we still have a very shallow emphasis or focus on the work. It's very much about awareness. We dump money into the work, but we still have employees that are lacking the skills that are necessary in order to work effectively across cultures, right? We have the awareness and we dump in the money, but we still are stuck with systems and policies that perpetuate inequities. You can see in this middle column here, some solutions that we begin to think about, some culturally intelligent solutions that we begin to think about in order to move us in the direction of addressing racial equity at both the individual and systems level, and doing it in such a way where we have what we call high impact intervention strategies. We're able to measure the work and the progress. We're able to build in accountability and have some high quality learning and development systems in place that are customized and that support a much more strategic effort. And then you can see that the outcomes then move us towards people having the skills that they need. That is ultimately going to reduce those inequities. We're going to create experiences where there's much higher levels of engagement. And then we're going to, as bringing CQ into the equation allows us to then create policies that are culturally intelligent and anti-racist policies and practices. So with that sort of baseline understanding and making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of definitions, I want to now introduce to you our amazing, or let our amazing panelists introduce themselves to you. And then we're going to dive into how they've been using CQ to address racial equity in the spaces in which they operate. So why don't we start with you, Jerry? If you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Great. Hello, everyone from the US. I'm in the great state of Rhode Island. I'm a restaurateur by training, and I've been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion work for 25 years, getting started first at General Mills in Minnesota. And so we work with restaurants, hotels, food service manufacturers, distribution on developing workforce, customer, community, and supply chain strategies around DEI. And we adopted CQ as our approach more than 10 years ago. So it's happy to be here. Done work with Sandra before, so I'll stop there.
Awesome. Yes, Jerry, so glad that you're a part of this conversation. We've been so grateful for our partnership with MFHA and all of the work that we've been doing together over the last couple of years. So can't wait for the folks to hear from you. Quentin, we will go to you now.
Thanks, Sandra. So privileged to be here. So I thought I'd frame a little bit about who I am by saying I grew up in the 80s in South Africa as a white young boy. And so the society I grew up in was all white. My schools, my neighborhoods, my churches, everything around me was white. In fact, the first time I met a Black person my own age, I was 21. Up until that point, the only Black people I ever engaged with were the Black woman that worked in our house and the Black man that worked in our garden. The Black woman that worked in our house always called me Klein Boss, which is little boss, because my father was the big boss. And the gardener that worked in our house, we would refer to him as the boy. And my responsibility was to give the boy his sandwiches. And I'm ashamed to say that to this day, I still don't know those men's names that worked in our garden. And so growing up in South Africa, I never knew what was happening in our country. It was only in the 90s that I started to understand. And in 1995 would be the first time I meet a Black person my own age. And sat at a table and ate with Black people, used the same toilet as Black people, realized a whole bunch of things that are happening in our country. And so in 1995, I made a commitment that I would start building bridges where my family once built walls. And so I use CQ as a tool to build bridges with organizations and people that I meet. So it's a privilege to be here today, Sandra.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Quentin. That's fantastic. Eris, why don't you tell the people about yourself and what you do at Dallas ISD?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eris Ryder, and I am the Director of Racial Equity, or actually one of the directors in the Racial Equity Office of Dallas ISD. I've been with Dallas for 23 years. I started as a teacher and then went on to become an administrator, and now I'm in central office. And this year is our first year that we are focusing on district-wide investing in an equity mindset. In June, our Board of Trustees made a bold declaration to the Black lives and families of our district. And so everyone in our district is on board, from our superintendent to our Board of Trustees, to every department in campus, to ensure that racial equity is not just something we talk about, but that it's embedded in our everyday systems. And so CQ is the way that we have started to build that equity mindset so that we can lay a foundation to go deeper and wider. Happy to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Eris. And certainly last but not least, Jennifer.
Hi, and hi from the UK. So I'm the executive director of an organization called Above Difference. We've been around for 2.5 years, probably just about as long as I found out about cultural intelligence and became absolutely passionate about it. And everybody who knows me knows that I could go on about cultural intelligence forever. We happen to be the leading provider of cultural intelligence solutions to the UK public sector. So we work across health and social care, education, policing, also the faith sector and the third sector. we have a signature line that's all about doing difference differently. And I think when I came upon cultural intelligence, what fascinated me about it and what I'm still passionate about is its opportunity to reshape the dialogue around equity, not just in terms of racial equity, but all sorts of equity. So I'm incredibly pleased to be here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And again, for those of you that are listening in, you're going to get lots of insights from our panelists. And what my hope is that by the end of this conversation, if you can walk away with one strategy that you can put in place, whether that's at the individual or systems level that you can take back to your organization, that will make a huge difference, not only for your organization, but for our communities across the country and across the globe. So as you're listening in, I hope you take copious notes and be thinking about one thing, one action step that you can take from this conversation and move the needle a bit further along in your organization. So let's get into the conversation. And I'm going to go back to you, Jerry, and start with this idea that, this can be a very sensitive topic, especially when we talk about racial equity and especially in light of just some of the challenges that have been some of the issues and incidents that have been taking place, not just here in the U.S., but across the globe. And it can make people a bit uncomfortable. So how do you, in your work in the hospitality industry, as you're working with multiple organizations, how do you broach the topic? And what challenges and opportunities are you finding as a result of those conversations?
Well, we are pretty direct about things. We practice what we call straight talk. If the baby, everybody loves babies and they're wonderful, but some babies are ugly. And in this case here, the racism baby is ugly, and let's call it what it is. We're in restaurants where customers are saying, I don't want a white server, I want a black server. And so what we engage senior leadership in is give us the scenarios that you struggle most often with. And so we were able to collect dozens of scenarios, of circumstances, of issues, of encounters, and then help people work through those by understanding how CQ works and how it can be applied to these circumstances. So we have established a reputation that whatever the difficulty is if you train your senior leaders properly, how to ask questions and how to withhold their judgment and really try to get behind their eyes. And, I have a 18-year-old grandson who is sleeping in the room right over there. And when we talk to people about when police officers stop Black folks in America, I worry about that because he got stopped. He just got his license, and he put his phone on while the police officer was talking with him, and the police officer was goading him, trying to get him to bait him into saying something. And so people have to understand that it's real. You have to explain what it is that you go through. This is no joke. My family's from Cape Verde, so I have African Portuguese roots. I'm raised here in the U.S. as a Black man. And even though I am well educated and I live a privileged life in some ways, my Blackness shows up. And I think people have to show people, they have to take them with you. You have to give them opportunities to speak live about it. Do it in language, in culture. We've had our kitchen teams that are often staffed by Latinos. So we have it facilitated in Spanish. And what we found out is the experiences you thought they were having were completely different when you finally got down and asked people the real hard questions. How you doing? How you feeling? How are you as Black people experiencing the COVID-19? So we find most of our leadership is white and white male, and they're not comfortable talking about race. So you kind of got to rub their nose in it. You got to get them real close and personal. And when you do, I think that's how we've started to make some breakthroughs.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Jerry. And, it reminds me of a qualifier that I wanted to make earlier when I talked about, part of why we're stuck. We're investing the money, but we're not making progress. There are some who are not they're stuck not because they don't know what to do, is because they're uncomfortable doing anything. And so often when we look at the issue of racism, a lot of leaders and a lot of organizations like to look at it as a societal problem, but not an organizational problem. And so that's part of jumping over the hurdle too, to recognize that racism is very real and it actually happens in my organization. So we've got to call that out. So great point there, Jerry. Iris, I'm going to jump over to you, and how has Dallas ISD approached this topic in terms of conversation, and what challenges and opportunities have you seen?
I think it's been a welcomed experience because, as Jerry said, and especially with the racial injustice events last year that came to a pinnacle, we had to have the conversation. And like you said, some people don't want to talk about it. Some people act as if racism isn't real. Some people don't think that Blackness is a part of who we are every day. And so we had to find a way to start engaging our staff members to be able to have those conversations, because we realize that our children are also going through racial trauma. And if the adult in the room can't intelligently open a space, a safe space for that conversation to be had, then the trauma will continue and then the behavior perpetuates itself. And so, like I said, for Dallas, it was easy as a district because we had our top leaders on board and it was something that had to be done. Also, we realized in our data historically over the last years, our African-American students and our EL students have always been the ones behind. And we've tried strategies and we've tried other things, but then we decided, we really got to get to the mindset of what's causing this behavior to be perpetuated. And so that's one of the reasons that this was one of our priorities this year, to make sure that we started a common language so that everybody could start understanding, yes, I do have biases. Yes, there are some things that I need to plan for. Yes, I do jump to some assumptions sometimes that I should not based on my previous socialization. And so just being able to have those conversations in a safe space, honestly, some people are really starting to do some honest reflections, and then it's starting to trickle into our classroom practices and into the way we do business and our human capital management and the way we start programs and initiatives, because now we're having to think about everyone at the table intentionally and how our decisions and our systems are impacting them.
That's great, Iris. Thank you so much. Quentin.
So I'm going to talk from the perspective of running engagements, diverse inclusion engagements with a racial underpinning, particularly in South Africa. So I normally start off by addressing the elephant in the room, or should I say the white guy in the room, because a lot of my participants are Black and they're like, what is a white person going to teach me about racism? And so we normally start with that. And I acknowledge the participants' fear and anger by just what I represent. And so I'm very aware by just the fact that I'm on this call, I'm white and I'm male, there's a lot of triggers that are happening right now. And so acknowledging that and legitimizing that fear and that anger is a real start for the conversation. And what I find is that most white people walk into these conversations very fearful, and most Black people walk in very angry. And by just legitimizing that, I find is the first step to getting to the real conversation, because otherwise we're just walking around on eggshells with one another. And so I found that to be one of the most helpful things when we start these engagements, and then getting into story sharing and sharing my story and my journey, and not trying to justify particular behaviors that I have, and really just laying it out there and saying, this is who I am. And that then creates a wonderful environment where we can have honest and real conversations.
Yeah, I love that, Quentin. And, one of the things that we talk about often with cultural intelligence is that it is very solid in terms of the research and in the approach, in that we're not about shaming or attacking, or making people feel awful, but there is an element about truth telling and just acknowledging, like you said, those feelings that people have. That can go a long way to begin to open up space for some really productive and effective conversations. Love that. Jennifer.
Thank you. It's been really interesting hearing from the other panelists. And I think for us, the UK has changed quite a lot since the events of last year. And we work a lot with, public health sector bodies, pretty big organizations who, following George Floyd and what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, had to really come up close and personal with a lot of the pain that was in their organizations that to some degree had probably been brushed away before and seen as being anecdotal, but suddenly they were confronted with it. And I work with a lot of boards who had to sit and listen to some pretty tough messages up close and personal. And so for us, working with leaders has always been the entry point for us in the organization. It's always been, looking at this from the potential of inclusive leadership and what does that actually mean? And how does cultural intelligence help you to be a much more inclusive leader? And that's always a really good gateway to come into this discussion with. And then we're also looking at really getting people to understand difference and culture and where those two things tie together. And what I love about cultural intelligence is exactly what you just mentioned, Sandra, that the great thing about the framework is that it doesn't perpetuate that blame culture. It asks the tough questions. It provides a space in which we can have the tough discussions. But like you said, Quentin, people come into this either with fear or anger. And neither of those perspectives are great places to start transformation from. So for us, it's trying to get people to that place where, they do have that curious, open mind, recognizing that diversity isn't a problem to be solved. And so, because that whole mentality of, well, inclusion is something we do to the Black people over there, I think is not a particularly helpful one. And so that space in which you get people understanding that culture impacts on all of us, inclusion is about everyone or no one, allows you to have the tough discussions about race while really letting people engage with it. And that's where I think cultural intelligence really works very effectively.
That's great, Jennifer. And that really leads into the second question. I think all of you have sort of begun to inch in this way, but how do you think CQ, or why do you think CQ is an important and necessary strategy for addressing racial equity? So again, I think each of you kind of started going down that pathway, but can you perhaps elaborate a bit more, because there are many models out there, and we will be the first to say, we're not saying that CQ is the only way. We're not saying CQ is the magic bullet that once you click your heels, all of our problems are going to be solved and there'll be no more racism in the world and everybody will be treated equitably. But we do believe that it is a core part of the conversation and work, and again, the foundation and strategic link. So why did you choose CQ over other models, and why do you see it as a necessary strategy, or one of the strategies necessary to help your organization or organizations that you are working with move in the direction of addressing racial inequities? Can I go back to you, Eris, with that question?
Yes, so when I think about that question, I think CQ helps us answer the now what. Because now that we've identified the problem, what are we going to do about it? I think we've been able to identify the problem for years. We know that things exist. I don't think too many more people are in denial because it's been glaring, but it's like, now what do we do about it? And so the CQ action and the CQ strategy makes you be intentional about the different situations that you may engage in, or when you're looking to develop things for students or for parents or for families. It makes you intentionally stop and plan on what is the best way that we can plan this experience to make sure that we are not causing any adverse experience for any of our marginalized groups. And so I think that's what it's been for us, the now what.
That's great. Jerry, can you think about that and respond to that question?
Sure. For us, we found that when we speak to CEOs, and a lot of our work is done at very high levels, they turn their head and go, well, tell me about this cultural intelligence, because for whatever reason, diversity has been demonized in some cases, and it's like a dirty word. If you say to the corporate suite, hey, we're going to have a diversity meeting, they run in the other direction. But culture, CQ can't, culture and intelligence can't be demonized. And CEOs are the keepers of the culture. So when we begin to help them realize the different cultural aspects of your workforce and what those experiences are and what they go through, I think Eris mentioned it, intentionality. We told them to be deliberate, intentional, and on purpose about asking the hard questions. What cultural perspectives are not present in the room, and who are we not addressing? And once you get beyond this being another flavor of the month, and they see that it's a muscle that can be exercised, that you can, once you begin to understand how to look at things from a cultural perspective, you can change your behavior. And we know that behaviors don't change until people's attitudes begin to change. And so for us, we've always made the business case. You don't have to like these people. I can't legislate that. But if you're going to be successful in business, if you're going to grow, that's where the workforce is going. It's going to become more Black, more brown, more female, more immigrant. And no matter what color of the leaders, no matter what cultural identity you have, you're going to have to engage all of them and show them that you're the leader for today. If they don't see that, they will not follow you. And millennials and Gen Z in particular made that clear during the pandemic and after the George Floyd event. We had so many people who said, our employees came back to us and said, why aren't we issuing a statement about George Floyd? Or two major restaurant companies, they had to reissue a statement because the employees said it was weak. We don't need a weak statement. I don't want to work at a company who doesn't have solid leadership. So I think as much as we've all been hurt by the pandemic, a silver lining, if there is one, has been that it's forced us to do some things that we didn't want to do, and that's look at the cultural makeup of our teams and our communities and our customers. And CQ is the best method for it.
That's great, Jerry. Excellent. Thank you so much. Quentin.
So for me, CQ takes the guesswork out of engaging with people around this. So for example, a lot of my participants walk into a session with a high drive, a high CQ drive. And so they have intrinsic and intrinsic interest, and they know it's important, and they know that diversity inclusion is important. And so often they walk into the workshop saying, well, why am I here if I'm motivated to engage with this? And CQ allows us to say, you might be motivated, but you really scored low on your strategy and your action. And when you go through this engagement, you are now turning your motivation into real action. And so what we've been able to see, people being able to focus on their scores and saying, what are my strengths? How do I leverage off of that? What are my weaknesses? What are the things I can do to implement and bolster those weaknesses? And so I've had participants leave engagement saying, I really have a grasp of what the work I need to do. Because I think a lot of work that's out there is often very out there and very theoretical, and people don't really know how to put it into action every day. And CQ gives you the opportunity to do that, particularly if you do the assessment along with the cultural values. It really takes the guesswork out of for people, and it becomes really specific to individuals to see how they can make their organizations more racially inclusive.
That's great, Quentin. Thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, and I would just like to build on what Quentin just said, because in working with organizations, I hear so many of those same messages. I think for me, it's the fact that there's a framework. I think that's such a powerful thing, because a lot of what we've done around this inclusion has sometimes felt a bit woolly or not quite clear where it comes from. And CQ's clear, it's got that framework. It's based on that academic research. And I think that assessment report that people do at the beginning really just gives people a place to start from. And I think that's incredibly powerful. I like the fact that it's developmental. I like the fact that when you're working with people, you're saying you can build on this. We can develop your cultural intelligence. So this is not just about looking at your assessment, which I know, probably all have experienced this. People are going, well, what did I score? And what does that mean? You're actually saying, well, look at this at the baseline, but think about what you need to put in place in order to develop this. I think it makes sense to leaders because they can see the opportunities for that development. And like you said, Quentin, I will often have people going away from our courses going, I can see what I can do differently now. And that's incredibly powerful, because those are those light bulb moments and the transformation. And I think the other thing I like about it is this cross-cutting nature of it. So when you're working with an organization, you can help managers who manage people, who are frontline managers, see how CQ can make a difference to the way that they engage with their diverse staff. But you can also work with the HR department to see how cultural intelligence can make a difference in the way that they recruit staff or they promote and progress staff through the organization. You can work with procurement to think about who they engage with, who they buy from, who they supply from. And that ability to flex the CQ model to fit a whole range of different circumstances, I think it moves organizations forward. And, you know, I'm sure many of you will be aware that about 25 years ago, we had an incident that probably reshaped the way we look at racial equity in the UK, the murder of the teenager, Stephen Lawrence. And at the time, what the judge said was that, you know, the institution involved was institutionally racist. And all its, and that meant that its processes, its behaviors, all sort of worked together to exclude and marginalize people of color. And the challenge I often ask organizations when I work with them is, how can you use CQ to make your organization institutionally inclusive, so that CQ runs through every part of that organization and everything works together to provide the equity that you're looking for all members of your staff. And that's a pretty radical change that CQ provides an opportunity for you to explore.
That's excellent, Jennifer. And I would think, if I'm imagining myself being someone listening in, and I would say at this point, this has been really great insight around why CQ is clearly foundational and the strategic link to this work. But how are you actually using it? I mean, practically speaking, what does that look like in the work that you're doing inside your organization or as you are working with different organizations? So I want you all to be thinking about this. I'm going to start with you, Eris, because we are in the heat of a massive rollout at Dallas ISD in terms of how we're using CQ and unconscious bias to address racial equity. But can you maybe give the folks listening in a high-level overview of literally how you are integrating CQ into the work at Dallas to address racial equity?
So one of the things that we're doing in our office is we meet with departments, central office departments, every 6 weeks, and it's called an equity progress team. And we look at different systems that have been set up, whether it be budgeting or hiring or curriculum or access to advanced academics. And we are actively looking for maybe biases that may have been unintentional, and helping them think through as a collaborative partner ways that we can make sure that we don't have hidden inequities within our district. And so that has been eye-opening because, you know, some things have been in place for years and people have never looked at it with that eye. It's just like, this is what we've always done. But now that we are intentionally being active about making sure that every voice has an equal voice at the table and that we don't have systems set up unknowingly to impede access, then it's starting to, you know, catch like wildfire. You know, everybody is starting to look from, you know, how we provide buses in certain areas to how we provide bus stops. So it's like, it's trickling down, and our goal is for it to be embedded. And we're not quite there yet, but like I said, it's catching on fire, and that's our goal, because we don't want racial equity to be the racial equity office's job. Advancing racial equity is everybody's job. Mm-hmm. And so we want to be the office that supports while we're leading the work. Eventually, everybody's office should have everybody looking at what is the equitable lens on the work and the plans and the initiatives that we're putting in place. And so that's how we're currently using it in Dallas, to make sure that we are either disrupting systems that are impeding students from progressing, or that we're solidifying systems that we know have equity embedded, to make sure that even after we have left our positions and retired and moved on, that it's something that's sustainable for the next generation to come in and continue forward.
Yeah, that's excellent, Eris. And I love that you started with the systems approach, because I believe very strongly that we cannot fully address racial equity if we do not address it at both the individual and systems level. And I will just add that on top of all of the fantastic work you're doing around looking at systems, you just finished a massive learning and development work with all 22,000 employees at the district, a district of 155,000 students, but all employees, teachers, staff, administrators have gone through cultural intelligence and are now in the middle of going through unconscious bias training. So that combination of the individual skill development along with these culturally intelligent systems changes are what make all the difference when it comes to tackling racial equity. Excellent, thank you. Let me go to you, Quentin. Can you give an example of how you've actually integrated CQ into some racial equity work with organizations?
So if you're anywhere in the world, every week there's a news article about some kind of racial issue that is happening. And I want to share a little bit of a story that will unpack it. So you and a friend are having a meal next to a river, and while you're having this meal, there's a child drowning in the river. So the two of you jump into the river, you swim to save the child. As you bring the child back to the bank, you barely save that child. There's another child in a river, and you jump back in and you swim. And now the second child, and now there's more children. And so you jump back in and your friend starts swimming upstream, and you shout to your friend, where are you going? Why are you swimming upstream? There's so many children drowning in the river. And your friend says, I'm going to stop the person throwing the children in the river upstream. And so those news articles that we hear every day in the newspaper is those children that are drowning. And I'm starting to say to organizations, I'm done with saving those. I want to start building bridges upstream. So create upstream solutions for downstream problems. And what I'm finding with leaders that we're working with in organizations, CQ is giving them the skills to build those bridges over those rivers so that we don't have to deal with these things down the river. And so it's about equipping leaders to be more effective with the teams that they're leading, particularly racially diverse teams, to be more effective. And so, yeah, that's how we're using it in South Africa, at least.
I'm so glad we're recording this because I'm going to use that one, Quentin. In a treaty, that's excellent. That was an excellent analogy. Thank you. Jennifer, an example of how you've been using CQ, very specific, practical example of how you've been using it to integrate into racial equity work.
So when we work with organizations, we're very clear that it's part of a journey, and we love the learning pathway that was developed as part of the CQ work. And so very specifically, we say we won't work with organizations who just want us to come in and do a one-day course or do a workshop. So from the very beginning, and some of the organizations we've been most successful with, we've worked with them to map out what that journey looks like, ranging from starting at the senior leadership. And I think it was Jerry who said earlier that, you know, leaders own culture, they define culture. So once you get that cultural intelligence into the senior leadership and start working across other kinds of leaders within the organization, then that's where we're beginning to see that real change. And leaders taking that step back and looking at their policies and procedures and going, well, hold on, you know, is this as inclusive as we thought it was? You know, now that we look at it with these cultural intelligence lens. And what we've seen with some of the organizations we've been most successful with is where they're on that journey, and many of them are still on it, you know, where we're embedding it very much at the senior leadership stage, then in looking at how the management takes place, but then also beginning to work around and working at other levels within the organization. And I suppose a key thing that we do as well is look at developing the internal resilience and capacity. So how do you take this forward? And this is where we're encouraging organizations to develop their own facilitators. So one of the organizations we've worked the longest with, which is actually a constabulary in the police force in the UK, they now have 4 accredited facilitators who are beginning to take over from us now to roll this out with our support. And I think for us, that's really important because we know then that there's a legacy there. We know the conversations will continue to happen. And we know that they're not just looking to an outside provider to come in to deliver the solution. And I think, you know, those are the elements that we put in place, and being a strategic partner of the Cultural Intelligence Center means that we can work in partnership with you guys to do that. And that's been really powerful.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jennifer. Jerry, you know, I know learning and development has been a big part of the work that you've been doing. I think about a few years back when you and I teamed up and we did a certification program. We had some big folks in the room, the CDO from McDonald's and many others like that. So I know that's a big part of your work with them, but what other specific things do you do as it relates to CQ and in helping them to address racial equity?
Well, like many of the folks we heard here, we focus at starting at the top. And Quentin, the first time I heard that story about the babies was with Julian Bond of the NAACP. Told me that story. So we start, especially as we're going through this pandemic, with these listening tours and encouraging people to go out and just ask how you're doing and listen, and then just listen and be quiet and let them tell you what's going on. And when you come back, you're going to begin to see some things that really need to be addressed. So we always encourage them to focus on unconscious bias training. So we use the same unconscious bias work that you trained us on years ago, and then move them into cultural intelligence, and then ultimately into inclusive leadership. What does that look like? And so we found out that this seems to work in the restaurant industry here, and the hospitality industry in general. We have people who are way up here in terms of their sophistication, and then we have sectors like distribution that are really at ground zero. There's not, they really can't spell diversity. They don't really know how to start. So you have to be flexible in being able to deal with people and meet them where they are. But we always come back to the business case. If you don't figure this out, you're not going to be able to sell, market, and serve a changing marketplace. And so even if people don't want to do it, they recognize that the data and the numbers suggest you are going to have to recruit African-American salespeople. You are going to have to learn how to develop women of color. Whether you like it or not, to be competitive, look what the other competitors doing over there. You will have to build your cultural IQ. And so, again, I think people have embraced, in fact, a number of our member companies have termed their initiative their cultural intelligence initiative rather than diversity and inclusion, because they like the term that much. So to me, it's all about exercising that muscle. We always start at the top, senior leadership people first, and then they cascade it down. The challenge is to try to get it to hourly people. You have to now start thinking about digital execution, because and the last thing I'll say about this is I think we need to be more aggressive and more intentional, because there are people on the other side who are fighting against this initiative. There are people who have said, we are ready for this Black stuff to go away, okay? And don't bring back this Me Too thing either. We don't want to hear that. And don't start with the Hispanics next, because people have gotten it they bought into this whole thing of win, lose, us against them. And so whenever you've got the us against them, we're going to save you from the people of color. You have some people who buy into that. So that's a challenge, and I think we have to be prepared for that. And I think we're going to get more of that, even though we've had a change in leadership here in the U.S. And politically things are being looked at from a more inclusive way than maybe the previous administration. But those folks aren't going away.
That's excellent, Jerry, and so truthful. Lots of questions are coming in, and I want to give a few minutes for us to be able to respond to those. But before we make that transition, what is one piece of advice that you would give to someone? I know that as I looked at the list of attendees, you've got a lot of DEI folks and other organizational leaders that are listening in and maybe considering integrating CQ into their racial equity work, but they may be new to the work. What's one big piece of advice that you would give them as they look to get started and to integrate CQ into their racial equity work? And I'll come back to you, Quentin.
So it's the Stephen Covey famous quote that says, private victory before public victory. And I think so often we drive inclusivity and diversity and equity programs at work, and then when we leave work, we go to our homogenous bubbles. And so there lacks an authenticity about when we engage around this stuff. And so my one word of advice is practice this privately first. Do it privately, reach out to people that look differently, think differently to you in your private space. It will hold so much more credibility for you when you go back to work.
That's great. And I love that, because again, it's all of us, and Eris said this earlier, at Dallas ISD, it's not just the job of the racial equity office. It's not just the job of the chief diversity officer or whoever might be leading the work. It's the job of everyone. And that includes people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So we all have a responsibility in this, but we have this responsibility to develop our own like you said, our own skills and our own awareness and connections with people who are different from us. I love that. Jerry, what's one piece of advice you would give if they're getting started with this work?
Well, there must be a Stephen Covey theme, because begin with the end in mind. I mean,
yeah.
What culture do you want to have? And can that culture survive and thrive as the world continues to move forward? If you don't make those changes, you won't be able to be successful going forward. So begin with the end in mind, and it's all about culture. So build on your own cultural intelligence, as you said, Quentin. Take care of your own junk in the trunk first before you start worrying about somebody else, and then stick with it. Be intentional and stick with it.
That's great, awesome, Jennifer.
I think there are many things I could say, but the one I probably will say is trust the model. I often have people say to me, can we have a little bit of cultural intelligence? Can you do us a 2-hour workshop? And I'm like, no, no, I'm not. It's a good model. It's based on a solid framework. And actually, if you're beginning this journey, then commit to it, and I think that's really important because there's so much research that underpins it. And that really means that if you get to grips with that, people will begin to work the model. People will begin to see how it transforms the things that they do. So trust the process.
That's great, Jennifer. Thank you. Iris.
I think the one piece of advice I would give a district or any organization is to just expect growing pains. Growth is not always comfortable. And so I think to share that in the beginning. And then I think, like Jerry said, to think about the end in mind. If we can bring every culture's brilliance to the table, how much better of an organization would we be? And so it's about a matter of, having a personal space to share your lived experience. It's about people being respectful when you're sharing your experience, even though it may not be theirs, but ultimately growing together. And I think in school districts, that's easy because we're always tracking data. We're always looking for ways to improve. And because CQ is something that can be improved, then nobody has failed. Everybody has room to grow.
That's good. That's excellent. I love it. All right. So our wonderful session administrator, Shana, has been tracking all of the questions that have been coming in. And so I know already won't be able to answer all of them. I can see that already, but she's been tracking for patterns and themes. So Shana, why don't you highlight one of the first questions and then I'll direct it to a panelist.
Sure, yes, we've definitely had a ton of questions this session, but it looks like a lot of people are wondering more about like leadership skills. So one really good question that got upvoted is, what do you feel are the skills leaders need to develop in order to enhance to facilitate these difficult and important conversations?
Okay. Jennifer, would you be willing to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I think, one of my favorite quotes I'm a John Maxwell coach, and one of my favorite quotes from John Maxwell is he says, a leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. I hope I got that in the right order. And I think for leaders, it's really understanding how they can use their leadership to influence the culture of their organization in such a way that it becomes an inclusive culture where everybody feels seen, heard, and valued. And that takes a leader being intentionally inclusive. I think one of the things we've kind of assumed is that inclusive leadership is one of those things you just kind of do if you're a leader. And one of, I think, the biggest realizations for leaders is, no, I'm not an inclusive leader just because I think I'm one or I wish to be one. I need to be intentional about recognizing the skills I need to develop. And when we're coming at that from a CQ perspective, it's not enough to have the drive. You've got to intentionally develop your knowledge around the cultures of the people who are in your organization and what their values are, what the norms are, what are the systems that impact on their lives. You've got to understand the importance of strategizing. And I have a lot of leaders say to me, well, I just do this intuitively. And I'm like, well, no, actually, that's not going to help anyone. So it's really understanding the importance of the planning and the checking. And it's important to understand what your CQ action looks like. What is it people actually see in terms of how you engage with people? And so really working through that, and we do a lot of leadership coaching as a key element of what we do, helps the leader to think about, okay, what is it I need to do to be this inclusive leader that I want to be?
That's great, Jennifer. I'm going to follow up and see if you have any additional comments, Jerry, since I know most of your work is in the C-suite and you're working with top leaders. So any feedback you'd give the individual?
For me, you have to show your vulnerability. I mean, I tell people about growing up and having been a homophobe. Now, I didn't know I was homophobe until somebody outed me in front of a very large group and asked me a tough question. And when I had to answer the question, it was about my son dating a white girl. And how did you feel about it? I said, well, why don't you date someone who looks like mom? She's chocolate brown. And the guy stood up and said, what if your son brought home a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy? And I was outed, because I had never really worked through my homophobia. In the church you grew up, it's a lot of, and we have this issue in the Black church in America, which nobody likes to talk about, but it's when you show people your vulnerability, you show them to look at, I got warts too. See, I got some cultural intelligence I got to work on. then it makes it easier for them, especially with senior leaders. You show me a CEO that she wants to tell everybody that she doesn't know the answer. They don't want to do that. They don't want to do. So you have to be willing to show them that I'm vulnerable. I'm working on this too. And if you open up, and once you get a couple of them to open up, it makes it a whole lot easier to move the needle.
I love it. That's great. Thank you. Give us another question, Shayna.
Okay, another question is about racial equity. So one person posed that many people say that cultural diversity is outdated and that we have to focus on racial equity, but it seems that the conversation is very binary, meaning just black and white and nothing in between. So what thoughts or suggestions do you all have on that?
That's a great one. I'm going to shoot that over to you, Quentin.
That's a nice, easy question we can answer in a minute. So I think you can't decouple race from inequality. So, and I think often we want to come into these conversations and only talk about race or only talk about gender but they're all intersectional, they all intercede with each other. And so we can't talk about them without that. And then also, I think it's just about acknowledging that people from different races don't have the same privilege that you do, and you don't have the same equity. And I think a lot of people are blind. So it's that really powerful TED talk by Michael Kimball, why gender equality is important for men. And in that TED talk, he talks about we're blind to our privileges. And so when we're blind to our privileges, we walk into situations and we're not aware of it. And so when we become aware of our privileges, we begin to understand how we can begin to change the equity in organizations. And I often say to people, you need to dismantle the system you benefit from. And so it's when Black people come in and say we need equality, people's eyes roll in the back of their head and say, oh no, not this again. But when I as a white person walk into the room and say we need to address this issue, it has more credibility somehow because I benefit from the system. And so whatever system you benefit from, if you're willing to break that system down, oh man, it becomes a much richer conversation than trying to always defend it. I don't know if I've answered it correctly.
Yeah, that's excellent. You did. And I see Eris nodding big time. So I want her to follow up and add some comments to that as well.
Yeah, I was amen in Quentin, but I think diversity was the nice way to try to address some of these issues when the world wasn't ready to address them. But racial equity now I think is hitting the nail dead on the head. And I think it makes some people uncomfortable. But it's way past time that we start talking about the real issue. And why the word race is stigmatized, I'm not sure. And so, we can't talk about racism until we talk about race. And so I think diversity was kind of like that theme of let's all just get along. And racial equity says, let's deal with these systems that have impeded certain groups far too long.
That's great. Why don't I think we have time for one more question, Shayna.
Okay, y'all kind of led into this one, but this was an interesting question. How do BIPOC deal with racial fatigue? So for people from the predominant culture, this is somewhat new, but for BIPOCs, it's the same conversations that lack action. And then how long must BIPOCs carry the burden of teaching and informing the racial harmony conversations?
All of our lives.
Oh, so let me first say for those that may not know what BIPOC means, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, and it's a very popular term here in the US and in North America. I'm not sure how popular it is in South Africa so that is Black, Indigenous, people of color. So if you were to translate that into places like the UK and South Africa, certainly those minority or marginalized groups. So with that said, Jerry, you already kind of jumped in, so quick response to that.
I worry we getting tied into too many terms and all this stuff. Do you use the pronouns? Do you not? Hey, people are spending, is it Latinx? And listen, it's about one person sitting down talking to another person and getting in touch with their humanity. And so this issue of race in America, which we never want to talk about. And so I got the opportunity to say the word racism in the CEO suite. I'm not missing that opportunity. Now, unfortunately, you get tired from doing this work, but there's an African proverb, when you're tired, keep on going. This work is going to need to be done for the entirety of my life and other people's lives. And so You know, tired isn't an option. The slaves couldn't be tired. They had to get up and keep going to work. So that's what we need to do.
Yeah, that's great. Quentin, one more comment?
So I think in South Africa, we have the legacy of Nelson Mandela, as particularly my age group that grew up with him in and around us. And so we are reminded every day that he spent 27 years in jail and committed his life to this fight. And so as young South Africans, we are picking up that mantle. And so we don't have an excuse to say we're tired of this conversation. And in many ways, when he passed on, he gave us that. And so we're driving that legacy that he left with us. And now we're all little Mandelas are making this world a better place. And so in South Africa, it's that sort of legacy that we need to hold on to.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, our time is wrapping up. We've got less than 60 seconds. So I want to say a couple of things very quickly. The first is that, again, I hope that each of you were able to take at least one thing that you've learned today, take that back into your organizations or take it back into your own heart and work to develop that as you want to grow as an individual. But one thing that you can do moving forward. The other thing that I want to say as we wrap up, again, the conversation today was very intentional to look at CQ and racial equity because it is a big issue. It is a big problem. It's not just a US problem. It's not just a North America problem, but it is a problem across the globe. And so we hope that from today's discussion, you were able to better understand why it's a problem and then what are some strategies that you can put in place inside your organizations to help address racial inequities and help close some of those gaps. The last thing that I will say is the beautiful thing about cultural intelligence is that while it helps to address racial equity, it also addresses many, many other forms of diversity and inequities. So next month, for example, we'll be celebrating International Women's Day, and we're going to have an amazing fireside chat with some amazing women from across the globe to talk about the issue of gender inequality and gender lack of inclusion in many of our organizations around the world. And so we address a whole bunch of issues that we know CQ can be a very powerful solution for. So thank you to our amazing panelists. You all were fantastic. This again has been recorded. It will be available up on our website by, my guess is by the end of the day tomorrow. So thank everybody for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, and as you head into the weekend, and until next time, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.